Hi, I'm Bob de Jonge from the University of Groningen, and I'm back with you with another video. This time I'm going to talk to you about the use of Spanish sé. Now let's first take a glance at a scheme with the different third-person pronouns in Spanish. Now what you can see there is that there are many different forms for the pronouns of the third person, singular and plural, but to our great surprise, the S forms, like sé and si, they show very few forms. So the question is, why is that so? And the reason, I think, helps us to explain the uses of sé. And as you know, in second language acquisition of Spanish, sé is always seen as a major problem while learning Spanish. Now, what is the difference between all of these other third-person pronouns and the so-called S pronouns? Well, that is that they have different morphological information. Many of these pronouns give you information on gender, on case, on number, but sé doesn't do those things. Now, let me first shortly tell you what this phenomenon is called. This phenomenon is called deixis, so these are deictic forms, and deixis can be characterized as the force with which the hearer is instructed to seek the referent of the pronoun. So a certain form can urge the hearer to look for the right referent. Now, of course, there are forms with high deixis and there are forms with low deixis, and since deixis has to do with the degree to which identification of an entity constitutes an inferential problem, high deixis forms should be used when the identity of the entity is most of a problem, that is, least obvious or highly relevant. So what I'm trying to say here, and I'm kind of supporting this with quotes from a very famous book on Spanish pronouns, the book by Erica Garcia from 1975, is that the forms that give a lot of morphological information, this morphological information helps you to identify the correct referent. So these are the high deictic forms. On the other hand, the low deixis forms should be used when the identity of the entity is less of a problem, that is, obvious and irrelevant to some degree. Now, this low deixis is particularly applicable to the S forms, sé and si, as you can see in the next slide. Now, in these slides, you see that both the S forms are marked in red, which means that they do not give any morphological information other than if they are oblique forms or in other words, non-subject forms. Now, let's take a closer look at sé. So, when we look at the slide, we can see that si and sé, we will focus more on sé than si because that is the most frequent of the two, is the only third-person pronoun that does not differentiate between masculine and feminine. It does not differentiate between singular and plural, and it also doesn't differentiate in case. So there is only a slight difference between stressed and unstressed forms. Now the question, of course, is why is this so? Well, as the hypothesis shows, this could be so because other forms are not needed. If sé has low deixis, its referent should be obvious, easy to find, or irrelevant. So when sé is used, the instruction of the speaker to the hearer is don't look too much because the referent is either obvious or irrelevant. Now let us walk you through some examples of the traditional uses of sé as they are distinguished in the different books of grammar or grammar books. I have some examples taken from an Italian book which basically has a very similar analysis of the pronouns in Italian, but I have adapted them to Spanish. Now, what is traditionally called the reflexive use of sé is exemplified in the examples Ada se mira en el espejo. Ada looks at herself in the mirror. This is a so-called accusative se. Or Ada se pinta las uñas. This is a so-called dative se. Ada paints her nails. And in fact, the pronoun se doesn't differentiate between accusative or dative. So that is a mere irrelevant fact for the language user. So why would we bother learners of Spanish as a second language with this difference? Because what those two instances of se have in common is that its referent is obvious. It is Ada, and Ada is the focus of the event, is the perspective from which the utterance is expressing something. So since Ada is already in focus, she is the most obvious referent of this pronoun se. We don't look any further. It is the same referent as we already knew as the referent in focus. Now, with both mirar and pintar, to look and to paint, basically what she is doing is she's doing something with herself and not with another referent that may need identification in the context. So there's nothing else needed than se, just to say clearly, don't look any further. It is the most obvious referent that we have in this context. Now let's go on to another use. This is the use that is traditionally called the passive use of se. I will give you two examples. Se ve una estrella, and this is a translation, and this translation in English does not really reflect the structure of Spanish. You can see a star would be an adequate translation. Or the sentence, se ven dos estrellas, you can see two stars. Now what Spanish tells us is when we have the sentence, se ve una estrella, we see that una estrella has the same number as the verb de, and in dos estrellas we see again the same number as the verb den. So in se ve una estrella we see 2 times singular, and in se ven dos estrellas we see 2 times plural. So in one way or another, both a star and be on the one hand and dos estrellas and ben on the other hand are claiming that these belong together. So what these forms tell us is that a star or dos estrellas, una estrella, are in focus. And in both cases we use the verb ver, and a verb like ver supposes two entities that are participating in this event. But we have una estrella in focus, and what se is telling us, we don't need another participant. We are focusing on una estrella alone. So, or all other possible reference are irrelevant. So we are focusing on estrella only. And of course, this is what this use has in common with the standard passive construction in Spanish, because the normal direct object gets the role of the subject. And this is what these examples have in common with the normal passive construction with the auxiliary ser. So this is why it is called the passive use of se. But basically what se is saying here, don't look for any other possible referent, because it is the same and the only one that we have seen before, the one in focus. And in these examples, in the translations in English, you can also say, you can see a star. This is not really speaking to the hearer. This is more in general. And one of the uses in English is you can use you for that. Now let's move over to the impersonal uses of se. I'll give you another example. Se prohíbe fumar, smoking is prohibited, or se es feliz, one is happy. Now what we see here, in contrast to se ve una estrella, we don't see any participants that may or may not be in focus, because fumar is not a participant and feliz is a modifier. So we are not talking about entities here. And therefore, the only thing that se does is saying, don't look any further. Its referent is absolutely irrelevant. And this goes very well with The utterances "smoking is prohibited" just means that anyone, for all persons, nobody in particular, but for everybody, smoking is not allowed. And the same goes for "se es feliz," which may be a general statement of saying, well, in this kind of country, people are happy, or one is happy. So again, "se," what it's saying is don't look any further. The referent in this case is irrelevant. So now I'm coming to the conclusion. When using "se," the speaker's instruction to the hearer is always the same. "Se" has low deictic force, so don't bother looking any further, or don't bother looking too much. In my last slide, I will give you some references on which this line of thinking is based. Basically, Diver 1975, later republished in 2011 or 12, and Garcia 1975. The last reference is just a grammar book that I used to pick some examples. I hope that this small short video has helped you in understanding the use and distribution of "se," and eventually also it may help you to explain this to learners of Spanish as a second language. Now, thank you for your attention and hope to see you again in a next video on this YouTube channel.